What we need desperately is a parallel course of innovation that involves the reclamation of indigenous wisdom and other, ancient esoteric wisdom about the safe handling of powerful technology. We give up thinking that we can understand everything because it is the quest to understand and control everything that is generating all of this meta-crisis nonsense, which, like you were saying, just snowballs everything in complexity and creates an even bigger metabolic footprint on the planet. And at some point, we just need to accept that even our godlike machines are going to bump up against something that is ineffable.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. Michael here. It seems one of the themes that's really been emerging as of late via this media vessel is the importance of, I would say, knowing where we came from so we can contextualize where we're going. And I mean this on both a meta sense and in a personal sense, in a personal individuation, meaning-making sense. And I guess it's perfect that I use that word because there are few better exemplars of this than Jung himself, who coined the term individuation. Clearly, he was such a deep student of history. But anyway, I generally just have an immense amount of respect for anybody who's really done the gritty intellectual deep dive in the trenches that it takes to truly understand the history of philosophy or science or art or spirituality, whatever it is. I respect the hell out of all of it. But what really gets my wonder whiskers standing on end is when people do that kind of multidisciplinary deep dive in the spirit of seeking, self-understanding, self-contextualization. Even more so if they've done so while doing their own thing creatively or professionally in a way that shines back out, refracts back out onto others. And that, in a nutshell, is why I'm friends with Michael Garfield. He is a true multidisciplinary wonder dipper. He's one of the most well-read, well-spoken, creative, highly experienced, unique beings I know. He is a writer, a podcaster, a musician, seeker. And though this may be the first time you've heard of him, if you are newer to the show or you are primarily a YouTube wonder dipper, we've actually done dozens of mind melds over the years, both on my show and his. This one is all over the place. It's mercurial in the best possible Michael Garfieldian way. We riff on high-weirdness, non-human intelligence, and how both of the above has this strange way of steering your life, sometimes in ways that you only see in hindsight, sometimes subtly, sometimes in a way that seems to beat you over the head. We talk about different ways to conceptualize said phenomenon, its relationship with that aforementioned Jungian individuation, your personal quest for meaning-making, pathfinding, soul-building, as James Hillman said. We also riff a lot on its relationship to what one of my favorite authors, Robert Anton Wilson, called the Chapel Perilous. And speaking of Robert Anton Wilson, I had just reread his, what I think is a classic, Cosmic Trigger, so influential on me. I cannot heartily recommend it to all of you watching enough. Such a fun mind meld. All the links that you're going to need for Michael Garfield are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. On that note, my friends, do tickle the algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. I say it every week. Every creator on YouTube says it to you, but it really is of the utmost importance. And if you're digging this conversation especially, check out our back catalog of over 300 other episodes that you will never see here on YouTube. They are audio only, and you can only hear them wherever you listen to pods. And there are many episodes with Michael Garfield. And if you want to enter the mind meld yourself, my friends, join us over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. You can riff with me and hundreds of other patrons on our patron-only Discord server, and we do monthly Zoom hangs, book club, you get rewards, and more at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I do hope to riff with you there. But for now, my friends, Let's meld minds with the wise, wonderful, whimsical Michael Garfield. You are like one of the quintessential Third Eye Drops guests. Like, we can talk about any of the shit that I get into on this show. And you're not only right there, but you're going to introduce novel angles that I haven't looked into, because although we're into the same things, it's like you have this whole fractaling web of things that you're into.
This is 18.
Oh, times, yeah. See, this is what I'm saying. It blows my mind, man. Like, anytime somebody who's been on the show a lot and they tell me it's been that many times, it's like I can't believe it. But so yes, my friends, this is why I always tell people, I badger people to go check out the back catalog, and this is yet another reason. We just started in the pre-talk, you know, having a little foreplay, a little a little feel around the rim of the of this the just the hall of mirrors that is this topic of, I don't know, extra corporeal intelligence. Or really, you can't, I mean, you can't say what it is, right? You can only say that it seems to be, and that people have seemingly been experiencing it over the course of millennia, and the names for it have transformed. But it's one of these things that's so persistent in the zeitgeist right now around this like conversation about extraterrestrials. And I don't know if this is something that you specifically spend a lot of time thinking about, because you have a lot of practical things to worry about in your life, but it's one of those things that I am always like thinking about, and seemingly almost can't avoid these days. It's just so front and center in the zeitgeist.
I mean, well, yeah. I'm actually getting married in June, finally. I've been with this woman for 20 years. We've got 2 kids, and we have a number of, I mean, I have episodes on various podcasts around the place. Probably on yours, Aliens and Artists for sure, my own, and Eric Davis's Expanding Mind, back when that was still a thing.
Oh yeah.
It was the first show I was ever on, talking about, we're getting married at this spot where I first saw UFOs as an adult. I had like
Wow.
one sighting as a kid, but like this was very uh, vivid and communal.
Hmm.
There were 4 of us there, and so I was like, well, that's clearly where we have to tie the knot, is like at the spot.
Yeah.
And of course it's a problem because it's on it's some weird access road off of Farm to Market, that like off of the lake, Clinton Lake in Lawrence, Kansas. That's a lake that was made by the Army Corps of Engineers. They like buried the city of Clinton, Kansas, or the town, under this
Oh
lake.
wow.
And there's a
Wait, they
pump
buried a
house.
town in the lake?
Yeah, they're like, okay, sorry everybody, we're putting a lake here. Go live somewhere else.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
And they there's a pump house on a bluff overlooking this place at the Woodridge Primitive Park, that I had 4 consecutive. Actually, there was a 5th time I visited that year that I didn't see anything, but 4 visitations of unidentifiable seemingly intelligent lights in the sky in 1 year, from 2006 to 2007, which, because you prompted this whole thing by talking about Bob Wilson,
Yeah.
and he's got this chapel perilous thing,
Yes.
which is,
Yes.
when things start making too much sense, and you're right on the cusp between like paranoia and metanoia,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you either go insane or you realize that you're part of the conspiracy. And this series of events happened right at a time in my life where I had no idea what I was doing, who I was anymore. I had lost track of my sense of self and purpose, which strikingly seems to happen with some kind of regularity. But we live in these times, right? We live
Yeah.
in these times that are just increasingly there are the stable features of the environment uh, are few, so it's hard to find a niche, like a stable thing to hang on to for a lot of us. And so yeah, I had 22 years of wanting to be a paleontologist, and then had found transpersonal psychology and integral philosophy and complex system science.
Hmm.
And my partner, who was younger than me and had not, wasn't ready to graduate, and I was like, am I really going to go off and pursue a paleo PhD after all? Like, especially in the wake of my fallout with my childhood mentor, Robert Bacher, and his crew of people at the Wyoming Dinosaur Society. So it was just like, these are the times when there's, what Terence McKenna calls the divine invasion.
Mm, hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
These are the moments. I mean, and this is actually, this happened about a year to the almost precisely a year after I had this whole sequence of events about living in a haunted house also. And I like learned all about poltergeists and how poltergeists
I've
uh
never heard
histor-
this story.
historically are associated with emotionally disturbed teenagers and young
Mm.
people. And I started looking into domestic spirits like brownies and the duende.
Whoa.
and
Yeah, you're going beyond my knowledge.
and I found out that basically yeah, there's this whole, the canonical lore around all of this stuff is that there are earth spirits that associate themselves with domestic habitations,
Mm.
and that if you're off your path, they will prank you
Mm.
until you find your way back. And in this particular case, it was like right at that cusp where I was like, do I go on to grad school or do I stay with my partner?
Yeah.
And I lived in this house with three other guys, this weird old spooky 3-story house with extremely high ceilings on the first floor and a kind of a weird musty old attic and dank basement. And the house next to us had just burned down right when we
Oh,
moved
wow.
in. It turned out there was a gas seepage from one of the gas stations a couple blocks away. And then later on, another house burned down in the same neighborhood. And so we all had to put monoxide detectors in our basements just in case. Because like I woke up one morning, like in the middle of the night, like I woke up at like 3 a.m. and there was ash falling outside the window. And I was like, what the hell? And
Wow.
it smelled like a barbecue. And it was because these houses were just spontaneously
Dang.
combusting in our neighborhood.
No brisket, just
Yeah.
suffering.
Yeah, but it was funny because the house next to ours, I remember right after we moved into that place, I looked down and in the basement was this like it had rained into this burned up mess, and there was a mangled remains of this guy's drum kit and a copy of I think it was Alex Gray's Sacred Mirrors.
Oh, wow.
It was like all charred and like like
Yeah.
an old treasure map. And yeah, and so but anyway, so I that's the setting where I experienced this. Me and my friends all experienced this haunting over a period of months that I was convinced was a haunting. At first they were not so sure because like my car was getting vandalized, Like the windows were getting knocked out and the tires were getting slashed, and they were assured that I must have had an enemy that I didn't know about, which is not impossible, but completely beyond the scope of my reckoning, who I would have pissed off so badly. But then also my buddy who slept up in the attic, his bed would shake at night, and
Hmm.
we all felt presences, and like doors in the house would slam, and it was just super weird. And I was recording my first home studio album on Ableton that year, Get Used to Being Everything, up in the attic. And at one point I remember just like tearing the headphones off my head and saying, "Leave me alone," because like something up there was so oppressive.
Wow.
And then I went out to Denver, and that fall there was the Integral Life Practice seminar for the Integral Institute, Ken Wilber's Integral Philosophy as applied to the praxis of daily life. How do you do body, soul, spirit, and shadow?
Hmm.
How do you you do physical exercise, you do therapy, you do meditation, and you do subtle energy practices together, and everything reinforces everything else. And we did a whole week-long practicum on this.
Cool.
Uh, and in that process, I learned this thing called 321, which was uh, presented to us by Terry Patton, who was a guest on Future Fossils. He's now deceased. May he rest in peace.
Oh.
Terry was a great guy, and he taught us this thing where he says it's basically it's anchored in kind of like Gestalt psychotherapy, where you start by describing this thing that's vexing you about something that you perceive as occurring in other people, or something that's occurring to you in dreams, or whatever. He gave the example of a gorilla that keeps attacking him in his dreams.
Dang.
And he said, okay, so you sit down and you write out that, you describe the gorilla in full detail. That's the third person. Once you've done that, you can invite the gorilla into a staged conversation. That's the second person. And you hash out a kind of exchange between yourself and this other being, and then ask it, what it's here to teach you and what you have to learn. And then at the end of that, you've basically just had a conversation with some splinter of your own psyche.
Yeah.
And so, at that point, you're well and able to integrate it as a first person perspective, as a part of the I.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, armed with this, I went back to Lawrence, and on Halloween of 2005, I went to the Ween concert at the Granada Theater, where I later opened for Papadosio in 2013. It's a great space. And like I had basically microdosed 3 different psychedelics
Yes.
at once, and uh, that's turns out that that's more potent than like a full dose of any one of them.
Mm, mm. Yeah, probably all serotonin, same like HT2A receptor or something getting peppered by
Yeah,
multiple assailants.
right. Just a tiny bit of different stuff, and then while I was listening to Ween, I had this sort of sonic,
Epiphany.
subtle body cartography, self re-rigging thing, where I was standing kind of back by the soundboard, and I could feel the sound waves moving through my body, and I could tell where there were tight spots in my body, and so I
Mm,
uh, tried to unlock them by focusing my attention on those places. And when I did, I slipped into a non-dual experience. And then in the midst of that, this presence arose,
mm.
and it was the same thing that was in the house. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm not in the house.
Hmm.
I'm,
I got theories already, but yeah, I don't want to interrupt your story.
yeah. So I was like, oh, yeah, this is okay. So very likely you are something that, uh, upon which I could operate with this 3-2-1 process.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And, and I did. And that was the beginning of a very long, complicated interaction with what I later came to understand to be my Jungian anima,
Okay, okay, yeah.
uh, but which I think had appeared in, outside of me as a kind of vexing, interruptive presence in
Mhm.
this house, uh, doing things like tearing down the bells that my girlfriend had given me for our anniversary off the front porch and kicking in the glass in the front door of our house
Wow.
one night, waking us up in the middle of the night when we were asleep and like all this stuff. And it was just like really, really trying hard to get my attention. And then later, after I thought I had integrated all of this stuff, I, when she and I had our first trial separation, like that spring, this is the spring before the UFO sightings. The That night, while my now fiance slash domestic partner, whatever, was across town in her dorm room, sleeping in her place for the first time in a while, another $1,000 of damage was done to my car
Wow.
in front of the house. And I had to drive my car limping to the auto shop to get the windows and the tires replaced. And then years later, I thought that I had done a fair job of, you know, stuffing all that stuff down and, folding it back into place. And when I was living in Austin, Texas, in like between 2011 and 2018, I had a number of my kind of psychically sensitive female friends report dreams about me, and other experiences, waking experiences about me, in which this hooded female form,
Mm.
this like a lady in black, was watching over me and protecting me, sometimes violently,
Hmm.
from forces that were disturbing me emotionally.
Wow.
So yeah, so that's kind of been an ongoing theme in my life, and there's much more I could say about that, but I've rambled at
Really,
great length.
yeah, really, really interesting. And I can only imagine this sort of epistemological kerfuffle that causes when all of these things are happening at once, where it's like you don't know if this is a person, you don't know if this is a presence. It seems like there is a presence, but then it also seems like, well, it seems like a person would have to do this. And it reminds me of, my your thought about the anima makes sense, but my first thought was like the personal daimon. I'm sure we've talked about the daimon to some extent before, but I talk about it all the time on the show, but it's this idea that, goes back to ancient Greece. The most famous early, um, I guess, story about it is the myth of from Plato's Republic, where they talk about how in the reincarnation process, the soul essentially selects a lot, like, like lot isn't like a lot of land. Um, and that's essentially the personal destiny that attaches to the soul, and then the soul, as it's incarnating, forgets about the lot and everything it's selected. But there's a daimon, so like a presence, like a spiritual intermediary being that also assimilates into you and this fate and serves as the sort of guardian to this fate. And then the popular updated psycho spiritual version of this is James Hillman's Soul's Code. And he talks about a lot of practical stuff like you're talking about, and that a lot of people who we know today as famous artists and musicians and authors or whatever were just like square pegs trying to fit into a round hole, where they like had really difficult childhoods, had weird shit happen to them, um, and they just were compelled to do a certain thing. And the whole idea is that, yeah, of course they're tormented because they came into this world with a purpose, with a destiny, with a thing that they're supposed to be doing. And all these people keep trying to cram them into these boxes. So that might manifest as, acting out, mental illness, whatever. But in the case of Jung himself, this famous period, again, it's like this liminal period, similarly to what you're talking about, Michael. Like, and we also riffed on this a little bit before recording, but in this liminal period in Jung's life, after he has his schism with Freud, he starts having all of this weird shit happen to him. And this is the period of time the Red Book is eventually written in. But some of the shit is straight up paranormal because he hears like knocking on his door in the middle of the night, voices speaking to him. And that's eventually what leads him to write this thing called Seven Sermons to the Dead, where it's essentially like this whole. He did like an auto writing all in like 2 or 3 nights, like a pretty large amount of text. That's essentially this sermon delivered to the dead by Philemon, his wise man archetype. Um, and it's this whole like Gnostic myth that he writes under the pen name of Basilides of Alexandria. So like the Gnostic teacher. And this is the only part of the Red Book that he ever publishes before his death. And then, as you probably know, the rest of the Red Book didn't come out till like 2009 or something. So yeah, man, and this is part of the stuff that just keeps Jung so interesting to me, because as much as people want to try to downplay the pretty much paranormal aspects of what happened to him and what he was talking about and the strange ways the psyche, quote unquote, can manifest in these forces that are largely, we try to cram in to the skull, really don't live in the skull. And the psyche itself, I think it's pretty safe to argue, in Jung's opinion, doesn't reside in the skull. Like the skull resides in the psyche, collectively speaking.
Yeah.
Somehow a thumbs up just appeared on your screen, and I've seen that
Oh,
happen
like this.
before.
This is the new Mac. It happens automatically on the Mac.
That is that
camera.
what it is?
Yeah.
Okay, because you didn't, dude.
Sometimes it just.
I don't think you even did that. So maybe I was just getting approval from Jung or something. He's like, good job describing that one. I don't know, man. We're haunted. This is already a haunted conversation. I hope that shows up on the recording.
Colin Frangisetto and the Cosmic Wink, right?
Oh yeah. Love you, Colin.
But yeah, this thing that you're talking about, I mean, it's so clear to me, having spent 5 years translating complex system science for an international audience full time, that intelligence is formally, mathematically, as described by the physics of information theory and statistical physics, thermodynamics, and the thermodynamics of communication, specifically, like the cybernetics, all these different ways of, chunking this out, that intelligence is distributed. And, for instance, in Future Fossils episode 212, I interviewed Jeffrey West of the Santa Fe Institute and Manfred Laubicler, an external professor of the Santa Fe Institute where I used to work. And that was a kind of a Hail Mary moment, because I had actually became a part of the SFI by trying to get Jeffrey West on the show, and then ended up like, working for them as a social media and podcast guy for almost 5 years, but wasn't allowed to have their people on Future Fossils the whole time, because it was a conflict of interest.
Okay.
And so I get Jeffrey West on the show, and it's interesting because, so I just listened to an interview that Damian Walter did with Ian McGilchrist, which I highly recommend. And one of the things
give a quick rundown of who they are, because I think a lot of people.
Yeah, so Damian Walter is the host of the Science Fiction podcast, and he's someone who, like me, has been deeply inspired by integral philosophy and has a lot of his exegesis of science fiction is about exploring the mythic undergirding
Oh, cool.
of science fictional narratives. He looks at specifically at like Jungian archetypes as expressed in
Mm,
stories like Dune and Blade Runner and
very
Star
cool.
Wars and so on. Uh, and he actually, it's funny because you and I were talking about the three body problem. He actually boycotts the three body problem because
Okay.
he says that it's a tentpole propaganda piece for globalist authoritarianism in the
Hmm.
face of some sort of opposition to this alien other. It's like a masterpiece of xenophobic militarism,
Mhm.
which it's hard to deny, even
Well,
in spite
don't
of the
spoil it because I haven't finished it yet.
yeah,
But yeah, yeah.
in spite of the fact that it is in other ways also a very damning critique of China's cultural revolution, etc. But still, um, anyway, so Damien, interesting dude. I hope to get on the show soon. Interviews another interesting dude. I hope to get on the show soon. Ian McGilchrist, who is a cognitive psychologist at Cambridge and the author of The Master and His Emissary, a book about the left and the right hemispheres of the brain,
Mhm.
which I have not read, but I've watched McGilchrist's ideas seep into the conversations like
Yeah.
everywhere I turn. And so I found this interview really fascinating. And one of the things that McGilchrist brought up in this conversation was that uh, religion, which is he kind of assigns right brain thinking, this holistic,
Mhm.
intuitive
Artistic. Yeah.
art, way of seeing. You see the negative space, you see the patterns of relationship. When Jill Bolte Taylor gave her famous TED talk on my stroke of genius, about how she had a left
Yeah.
hemispheric stroke and she had a
Yeah.
non-dual experience. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about, like knocking out the analytic functions of the brain, the problem seeking, problem solving. uh you know I'm over here and you're over there, and how am I going to rationalize this and operate on
Mhm.
it, kind of stuff, and just seeing how the pieces fit. And McGilchrist says, as makes sense for reasons I'll explain in a moment, that actually when you poll scientists, it turns out that Nobel Prize laureates and other highly acclaimed elite scientists are, uh, by percentage, more religious
Hmm.
than elite members of the humanities, and in
Interesting.
physics especially so.
Interesting.
That like atheists are like, I think he said something between like 4 and 9%
Wow.
among elite physicists. I mean, you go
Yeah.
back and you look at all of the founding quantum theorists and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like Einstein and general
Sure.
relativity and all of them were devoutly spiritual. Like they all
Yeah.
had, and I'm not going to make a spiritual religious distinction, because all of them are pointing towards something greater, because it's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the part of the brain responsible for this conciliant operation of seeing how everything connects is the same part of the brain that gestures beyond the self as an individual actor in a senseless cosmos.
Right. Right.
And so
I gotta bring this up real
yeah,
quick because I know Bobby Azarian to some degree, and
definitely
I'm sure you've read. Have you read his book, Romance of Reality?
bits of it.
Okay.
But
So
I mean, I've spent so much time arguing with him online. I feel like I read his book, but I really owe him a thorough read, and I'm gonna have him on the show soon,
so
also at some
and
point.
so I you should check out our most recent because I've done two with him. The most recent one. So this is now, a year or two post the book coming out, and he started that conversation with, "I'm ready to say some things I didn't want to say before," and I was like, "Oh, this is intriguing." So he already starts talking about this in Romance of Reality, this idea that there is some sort of natural teleological bend in the cosmos, and that you really can't make the universe make sense without some sort of at least extendedly natural teleology. But he also said something to me that really buttresses your point and Ian McGilchrist's point about how there are very few atheists when you start looking at physics, and I assume that this is probably even more true for people who look at like physics on a cosmological and evolutionary level. And I love this point that he made, and it's that we've actually proven at least a god light numerous times over by the initial standard that was presented. But what ends up always happening is once we wrap scientific and mathematical language around these spiritual ideas, it's no longer spiritual. Now it's scientific. So we just keep moving the bar for what is spiritual or God or divine, because once we gain, serviceable um empirical techniques to wrap around it, well, now that's not God anymore, now it's natural. So the bar just keeps moving and keeps moving and keeps moving. But like, if you zoom out enough, for so many, I mean, you could get into the fine tuning argument and like the very narrow um parameters that the physical laws of the universe have to exist within for it to exist at all, let alone the formation of elements and planets and solar systems and galaxies and complex life forms. Randomness just doesn't fucking cut it. So yeah, I think that's it. I think it makes sense, right? That how could you look at the totality of all the data and the unlikelihood and just purely chalk it up to pure chance? But what's funny though is yet it's those voices that seem to dominate, right? Like the people who are ready to chalk it all up to coincidence or multiverse theory, or just, oh, some version of we just live in the one universe where of all the billions or trillions of failed universes that happen to be here, so of course you have a bias because you just got lucky, so you have the luckiness bias or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, there's a lot there. But
Yeah, there is.
before I dive into that, I just want to say that the point in all of this is connecting it to Jeffrey West. Here is an esteemed physicist formerly at, Los Alamos, whose work on biophysical scaling laws, meaning understanding how resource transport networks in the body lead to patterns where, as for instance, an organism grows, the surface area of the organism grows by a power of 2, but the volume grows by a power of 3. And so all of these distinct biophysiological properties cross thresholds as that happens, such that, for instance, whales have dramatically more anti-cancer mechanisms in the body than humans do, but also the number of heartbeats that a whale has is roughly the same as the number of heartbeats a mouse has in its life.
Wow.
It's just 1.5 billion heartbeats over like 100 times the lifespan, happening over a much lower frequency scheduling. And then he started looking at cities, and he started understanding how in cities and organizations, his book Scale goes into great detail about this. And I interviewed him several times on the Complexity podcast back when I was still at the helm of that show about this stuff. But his scaling laws work with others, including Jim Brown, Brian Enquist, Chris Kempis, Elisa Mora, and many other people, into the regularities of scaling in the transport networks of cities and human institutions.
Are you talking about like physically transporting people, or are you
both,
talking about
yes,
IT?
both information technology, physical infrastructure, and also social networks.
Interesting.
Okay, so and they operate somewhat differently,
Mm-hmm.
because, for instance, as a city grows, the number of gas stations scales sublinearly because you don't actually don't need as many per, like, if you double the number of people in a
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
city, you only need like 170% the number of gas stations.
Okay.
It's like 0.85, but and it has to do with this like a 3/4 kind of power law that he gets into in the book. But the number of social encounters scales super linearly,
Hmm.
and in fact
Yeah.
super exponentially, because you are running into dramatically more people
Hmm.
than
Yeah.
you would at every street corner. And so there's this bizarre property of cities that looks uh, it has to do with density of interactions. It was like there was a threshold that we crossed between foraging societies, where actually as like foraging societies grew, they were actually less dense. This is work that was done by Scott Ortman and others, that they found that until they learned how to create the transport networks in a community, then that density was a disadvantage. And so they were like larger communities spread out more and more until something clicked and a new regulatory architecture came on top of it to
Mm-hmm.
organize everything. And then they became more and more dense. And that's actually something like what we see in the transition from bacterial to nucleated
Hmm.
cells,
Hmm.
that like really, really big bacteria uh, behave according to this. This is Chris Kempus's work. They behave one way, and then it flips, and then you get, the kind of inverse, um, with nucleated cells and with multicellular life. At any rate, the point is that uh, Jeff has spent his whole life staring down the barrel of this stuff, and at the super exponential scaling of novelty production
Hmm.
in cities, to call out to the angel of Terence McKenna here. And
Novelty.
novelty, yes, the novelty wave. Well, he's like, I mean, there's some truth in what he was saying about time wave zero, to the extent that, or digital technology has precipitated this enormous pressure wave, pulling people into urban conglomerations. And now human beings and our domesticated livestock and so on are like the vast majority of the vertebrate biomass on the
Hmm.
planet.
Yeah.
And the wheel created a world in which everything has to serve the wheel. So we've created all of this impermeable pavement over everything. And so what is, there are these forces that are greater than us that are exerting a top down influence on our behavior. And
Yeah.
part of it is the promise of wealth and opportunity that comes out of the super linear scaling of social interactions, such that uh, per capita income and per capita patent production and so on in cities is more than twice. Like if you double the population, it's like, I think, 230% the number
Hmm.
of patents,
Yeah.
and so on. And also organized crime and disease and all of these other things that depend on social interactions. And
So
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 there's,
are these all things that go into that number of like novelty increase that you were talking
yeah,
about?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes
So,
sense.
yeah, so, and it has to do with just the fact that recombinant processes run away much faster than merely additive processes. 3 times 3 is 9, but 3 plus 3 is only 6.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and so, if you start thinking about things in terms of networks, you can see, the edges out from 3 different nodes to the other 2 nodes, and you get more edges than you would just simply, you know, stacking them. And so at any rate, Jeff, I've heard on several occasions, and in fact also on his episode of Future Fossils, basically point to some sort of transcendental principle. His wife actually is a Jungian therapist.
Hmm.
And so that should come as no surprise that he has alluded to rather coyly, because I mean he does still work for a very, and like the Prada of scientific brands, so he has to be careful what he says. But he definitely seems to believe in a greater intelligence. And how could you not, when you see that corporations live and die and breed and transmit information the same way that organisms do, and
Hmm.
that intelligence is something that doesn't seem to exist merely on biological substrates, but exists in the information transfer on blockchains and national constitutions. And that when you get into like Bobby Azarian talks a lot about Tononi and Koch and integrated information theory, and this idea that we might be able to formalize notions of consciousness by understanding the measures of mutual information between different components or agents in these complex systems. And so therefore we may be able to actually measure the intelligence and possibly the interiority or subjectivity of something like the sun,
Wow.
with its complex magnetic fields.
Ooh, there's a topic for this
Yeah,
weekend. Yeah.
that's where SFI will not go. But
Yeah, that makes sense.
but
Yeah.
I've heard Jeff in any way in this episode with Jeff, he was saying that basically like these superlinear novelty production dynamics lead to uh, an escalating curve that he calls the finite time singularity, which like Ray Kurzweil says, we're going up this hockey stick thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
when you zoom in and look at it in fine detail, it's actually innovation creates crisis generating externalities that provoke another bout of innovation
Mm, mhm,
that
mhm,
then
mhm.
create more externalities even faster.
Yeah,
And so you get to this point where the system can no longer adapt to the pace at which it is generating its own crises, and something has to give. And so there's either there's a collapse or there's a transition into a kind of a new order. And we see this all over the place. We see this in the emergence of
yeah.
complex life. We see it in the emergence of language. It's described as the error catastrophe in other kind of the emergent syntax of things. And West says, and this is the punchline here, that technological innovation is not going to get us out of this, because technological innovation is what is begetting this problem. And that maybe what we need is something like a new axial
Oh, wow.
revolution,
Cool.
that we need a cultural or spiritual revolution, akin to what it sounds like McGilchrist is calling for,
Yeah,
where we begin to see ourselves as part of this emerging planetary meta
man.
individual.
Man. Yeah, and to me, you have in many, many ways done laps, almost closer and closer laps around why I'm so drawn to Platonism, because I feel like that paradigm is the only one that wraps everything you just talked about into some reasonable summary. In that, of course, these things that you're talking about are built right into the metaphysical foundations of this system of philosophy. The logos, the idea that there is this like greater mind that we're all participating in, and math is and discovery of new mathematical laws are almost like we're doing archaeology in the furthest reaches of what the human mind is capable of. Because if you look into like Plato's idea of the psyche slash soul, like for the Greeks, this psyche wasn't just mind, it was soul. Mind was part of soul. The highest part of his tripartite soul is logos. And the greater degree that you can build a strong logos and exercise that facility, you can do that kind of archaeological exploration into these higher laws. And all these people that you're talking about are doing it. Like, I think it's possible to do it in a more mystical, like sort of, McKennian, and he would talk about platonic hyperspace. And that's, this is exactly what he's talking about. But I think there's different ways to skin that cat. I think that psychonauts and artists are doing it, but I also think Roger Penrose is doing it. I think all these people are doing it, and that's one of the reasons Penrose considers himself a Platonist. But yeah, this idea that we are not as much discovering thing, or not as much inventing things as we are discovering things. And if you get too hyper, in the McGilchrist or psychology terms, if you get too hyper left brained and everything starts acquiescing to that way of thinking, clearly something is out of balance. And doesn't it seem, Michael, too? I mean, you're so tapped into so many different streams of information, not just the scientific, but also, philosophy, festival culture, psychedelic culture. And what have they all been talking about for the last few decades? Like the reemergence of just the opposite, like the feminine, the right brain, the artistic, the intuitive. And it almost seems like we're coming to the same conclusion on every, it's like the famous metaphor of the blind people feeling the elephant. It's like we're all understanding that this is what we require, is to sort of see ourselves as more than these like discrete bits of matter that are evolving in this cold world of resource competition and shit. Like we're all understanding that that's not really sustainable, and we can't just keep continuing to operate as if it is sustainable. But no one's really quite sure how, like, how to make that a reality. If it's because language isn't going to do it. Stories and myths definitely help. Embodiment and feeling it yourself definitely helps. But short of some crazy like 100th monkey type situation, or McKennian 2012 heightening of consciousness type thing, it's hard to see how that happens. But it seems like we're all kind of waking up to that's what we need is exactly this. But yeah. So I mean, I hate asking giant questions like this, so I'm not even going to ask it. I'm just going to turn it back over to you, because I don't want to ask the question that's implying.
I mean, go ahead, but just to make sure that we get back to something you said earlier.
Oh yeah.
Talking about randomness, I want to invoke another late great physicist, Murray Gell-Mann, one of the founding Nobel laureates at the Santa Fe Institute, who discovered, well, he didn't discover, he predicted the discovery of the quark.
Cool.
And his work on particle physics is legend. But he realized, you get to the floor, the sub basement of reality, and you still don't have the explanations that you went looking for. And so you need to start talking about emergent properties in the relationships between things. And those, that's the essence of complex systems, is the emergent dynamics that cannot be predicted by looking at ballistic Newtonian equations.
Right.
You can't just use calculus and measure an arc. You actually have to simulate things in a computer and see how they play out. And so again, that actually predates digital computing with the thought experiment. And so a lot of this, the Greek philosophy that you're referencing here is a kind of preliminary thing, which is why you get into, Plato's metaphor of the cave
Yeah.
is all
Yeah.
about simulation. And so Gelman had a number of papers that I discussed with his co-author Miguel Fuentes back on Complexity Podcast, I think episode 92, where he interrogated the idea of randomness. And, for me, this first cropped up in a presentation I saw on the simulation-based evolution by a Haifa University evolutionary biologist named Adi Livnat, who was kind of reviving Lamarckian evolution by saying that actually it turns out that repeated behavioral interactions with one's environment, there are all these things that can't be explained merely by sort of normal Mendelian inheritance. But what we see is that there are uh, basically behaviors of the genome that mimic, not mimic, the mirror behaviors that we see in the learning mechanisms of the brain, Hebbian learning, where neurons that fire together wire together. We also see genes that are expressed consistently move closer to one another on the genome and eventually fuse. And then in some cases pass on and through the germline. And so Lamarck was not totally wrong about the notion that interactions with the environment can lead to complex anatomical or behavioral traits in the offspring. And so this is interesting because this suggests that there is something like a hill climbing behavior in mutation, and that there is this is gradient descent is one way to talk about it, or like navigating a evolutionary fitness landscape. If you want to talk about like Stu Kaufman, who I interviewed in Future Fossils 125, who came up with this notion of the NK fitness landscape, and another brilliant former SFI evolutionary biologist who lives here in Santa Fe and has done work with Penrose on
Oh, cool.
the microtubules and quantum consciousness stuff.
On
But
that note, without
yeah,
just a 2-second interjection, I saw. Do you know Sabine Hossenfelder, the physicist? She has a YouTube
mhm,
channel.
mhm,
She's typically pretty skeptical in general, but she just did a video like a day or two ago about a new paper on microtubules exhibiting quantum processes, and it seems like it's true. Like it seems like they have very recently proven that there are quantum processes going on in microtubules, a la Stuart Hameroff and Penrose, which
mhm.
that might sound like Greek to people who aren't into this like consciousness theory shit, but for people that are, it's worth checking out. The paper itself is pretty tough to read, but her summary of it is pretty good.
Well, I actually just read a fantastic review put out by IONS, the Institute of
Yeah, yeah,
Noetic Sciences,
yeah, yeah.
on non-physicalist models of consciousness in Frontiers of Psychology. And I interviewed the lead author of that paper. I'm going to mangle her name, unfortunately. It's Helene, Wabe. Helene Wabe, who co-authored this paper with Dean Radin and two other
Yeah.
people. And they talk about uh, integrated information theory, and they talk about the orchestrated, whatever it is, reduction, the microtubule stuff. But I want to say that for people who are interested in quantum biology really need to read John Joe McFadden's book Quantum Evolution, which I read in 2004, 3 or 4, I guess 3. And that was a pivotal moment for me because he lays out a theoretical framework for explaining some of the most puzzling and persistent questions in biology and consciousness, including the origins of life and the nature of consciousness, by pointing to the fact that the biomolecular interactions are all quantum. And so, for instance, and this actually ties into what I was about to say about randomness, which is
Yeah.
that, there's that famous creationist claim that the improbability of a complex cell emerging from a pre-biological molecular primordial soup is akin to a tornado blowing through a
Yeah.
junkyard and assembling a working 747.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, well, actually, no, because what we're talking about is a quantum operation where in an otherwise incalculable number of possibilities, uh, all of these different possible permutations are executed in massive parallel in a superposition of outcomes that eventually collapses when that molecule interacts with other molecules in order to reproduce. And so he basically said that, like, this is the evolutionary telos that we're talking about here, is that the drive to connect, to enfold, to transcend and include goes back at least as far as the origin of life in chemical self-reproduction being something that is connecting things into larger and larger wholes, which prefigures cellular endosymbiosis and multicellularity and so on later. But it may go as far back as the Big Bang, where, like, the one free miracle that Terence McKenna talks about physicists asking for with the Big Bang is, why did it happen in the first place? And symmetry breakage seems to be about the self-measurement of the cosmos through interaction. And so, any collision between pre-particulate potentia, any interaction would be something that creates information. Like this brilliant, maybe now graduate, but he wrote this book as an undergraduate. Vidur Mishra, who was a student of my mentor at Penn State University, Richard Doyle, wrote a
Oh
book
yeah.
called Infoboris. And Bobby Azarian actually wrote a blurb for this book, and I designed the cover for it. It's a book about non-duality and information theory, and how basically information being the difference that makes a difference, in the words of Gregory Bateson, you cannot remove the issue of interiority or subjectivity or an observer or
Yeah.
like some kind of sense making operation from that,
Right.
because when you're talking about signal versus noise, it's like, to whom is
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
what it
Yeah.
amounts to. And that's the point that Miguel Fuentes and Murray Gell-Mann were getting at when they said that our measures of randomness and complexity are based on, in at least one common measure of complexity is based on algorithmic information,
Yeah.
which,
And
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it even like harkens back to the sort of core Kantian mind fuck of that you can never know a thing in and of itself. You can only know how a thing seems based on measurement and your rational interaction with the measurement and the thing.
That's Bob Wilson's reality tunnels there
Yeah,
again for
that
you.
too.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
too. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It
totally.
all ties in. Yeah.
So Gell-Mann and Fuentes wrote a couple of papers on basically the prosecution of this idea that maybe randomness is not ontological. There you
Right.
go, drinking game. The
Yeah.
third eye drops drinking game.
Dude, we're an hour in. We're
Ontology.
not getting drunk today on ontology,
No, we're
unfortunately.
not. But
We had a few epistemologies. We had a few
yeah,
teleologies. I think they're all.
we haven't even done
Yeah.
methodology yet. But okay, so, but yes, methodology disclosing ontology is a big deal, and that's and herein is the thick of it, which is that ultimately something is measuring the algorithmic complexity of
Mm-hmm,
something,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and when the reason I brought up Adi Livnat's work on interaction based evolution is that he was basically saying, the conventional, the Darwinian synthesis suggests that mutation is random, but here we see it descending a thermodynamic gradient, or performing active inference in like a
Yeah.
Carl Friston kind of sense, based on the best way to minimize free energy or uh, dissipate energy into the environment, or reduce uncertainty, or like there's all these different ways of formalizing it. And so that's not random. It just appears random
Yeah.
because we are coarse graining things. We're looking at them from this scale
Yes.
rather than at the scale at which these behaviors are actually unfolding. And so when you actually go down to the genetic level, maybe not all mutations, but a lot of mutations are actually a kind of intelligence that is responding to signals from the environment.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And uh, and so anyway, Gelman and Fuentes basically said that they think there's no way to say for sure, and they wrote the mathematics of this that are incomprehensible to me. But the premise of it is sound.
Right.
It's, makes sense to me that basically we can't say for sure what is, like, whether randomness exists. We can't say it doesn't exist, but we certainly can't say that it does, because time and time again, processes that seemed random eventually yielded to some kind of investigation of their causal structure.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And this is also evident. When I was just recently on, big props to Danny Jones and his
Yeah.
excellent show. And I was on Danny Jones's show, and I was talking about this paper that came out again. I'm just like totally, saturated in SFI research at this point, but it's because they've got so many external professors, and they've been around for so long that they have, some kind of stamp on so much of this domain in one way or another. But in 1999, and this brings us all the way back to aliens,
Perfect.
Lockman and Michael Lockman, Mark Newman, and Chris Moore, who Newman and Moore's old kitchen table I have in our sunroom in our house. And Chris is just one of the finest people I've ever met, as far as like being a brilliant computer scientist, and also just a genuinely warm and affable human being who loves to explain big ideas to people at whatever level, and has a fantastic PBS documentary called The Majesty of Music and Math I highly recommend.
Oh, cool.
He did it with the Santa Fe Symphony. So he goes through all these, like he goes through like Bach and like all these, the mathematics of music, while they're giving the musical examples with the symphony at the Lenzik here in Santa Fe. He and Newman and Lockman wrote this piece on the physical limits of communication, where they said that an optimally encoded signal, encrypted and only perceivable to its intended recipient, is to anyone else indistinguishable from black body radiation or noise.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, other people have made the same point. Edward Snowden had an interview a few years ago with Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he said SETI might be missing the ball completely, because we're looking up thinking that we're just seeing radio noise, when in fact we're seeing messages that were intended for someone else. And that, advanced intelligences are just better at encryption than we are.
Yeah, there's an answer to Fermi's paradox there, right there.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So you can get around all of this dark forest, Cesian Lu stuff by just saying, like dark forest doesn't matter, because if you're smart enough, you can. And just a shout out to the fantastic and doomed Netflix Amazon Prime series, The Peripheral, based on William Gibson, where they've got people in the future that speak in encrypted
Mm-hmm.
pigeon like languages. They have,
Cool.
they have some sort of encryption speak, and it has to be subtitled. And I was like, oh, I love it. I love it.
That's cool.
That's totally where it's headed, because our cybernetic interfaces, we've already got real-time translation available in your sunglasses and stuff like that. So it's only a matter of time before AI is just allowing all of us to engage in weird twin speak,
Yeah.
where
And I mean,
every one of us has our own,
and
you
even if it
know,
doesn't go inside your head, man, how often are you away from your phone? How often are you away from something that could be listening? Like if you live in China, forget about it. Like I would assume that I'm being spied on all the time. I kind of already assume that I'm being spied on all the time here. Like I said, I forget what I said, but I said something in the car the other day, like that was somewhat controversial, and was like, "Ooh, I might have just said this in a free zone because I left my phone at home." No, like it, we're headed there. Whether you like, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are eager to. I'm never letting that happen. I'm never putting Neuralink, and it's like, okay, you already have a Neuralink. It's right here. It's just not attached to your brain. And I agree that that is an important threshold, but let's be real. We're already cyborgs. Many people have said this. You've said this. I've said this. Many people have said it.
oh, for sure. I have a song on my latest studio album called Signal. Uh, and it's just about this feeling that I had living in Austin, where, you're almost 2 hours away from national parkland, and you're just surrounded by cities in every direction for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And, I had moved there from Boulder, where at least on one side, you're walled in by mountains and, relative wildness. And in Texas, it's just not at all the case. Like, you are corralled just as much as the livestock in every direction, and you live in this grid of electromagnetic radiation and, other people's thoughts. And I'm very sensitive to this stuff. My wife makes fun of me because I bought a silver lined beanie,
Oh
because
yeah,
we live so close to the junction box for, our neighborhood, and I
yeah.
do all my work in the office with the Wi-Fi. And so I sleep on an earthing mat, and I sleep with the silver lined beanie, because I'm just like, I I'm permeable enough as it is.
Yeah, man. You don't
But
need
this
you don't need the daimons getting in there
right
too.
the the song uh says, even in the city, girls and boys are constantly suspended only in a soup of human nature, tamed and disassembled as the fires inside us are externalized and then extended.
Mm.
Even as it makes us, it destroys. The gods are all prosthetic, high on death denial, but still corporeal and pathetic. Animals and angels making love, always allopoietic, meaning, the other making. Uh, but even in our detriment, we're poised to grow beyond these fetters. Luciferic wildness spreading wings in the domesticate to love the world entire, and as brightly as we were intended. I want to live where there's no signal,
Mm.
And so last weekend, I was up in the Jemez, celebrating my friend's birthday. Jemez is this, as I was telling you before the call, is this place just past Los Alamos, up on the lip of the Valles Caldera. So again, like, how ridiculous is it that the United States nuclear research mecca is, and the particle accelerator that they keep there, massive stores of plutonium and so on, also happens to be, directly adjacent to this dormant volcano, dormant, not extinct. And
That's so the UFOs can fly in and out of there.
my buddy who grew up in the Jemez says that, he saw alien craft all the
Dude,
time
I mean,
growing up.
if they're anywhere and there is a tie-in with the government and nuclear shit, I mean, why wouldn't they be there?
And so we were out there celebrating his birthday last weekend, and it was during this historic solar storm where people could see the aurora as far south as Florida. Unfortunately, it was storming, and so we couldn't see anything. But I really was like, "Where is my beanie?" I couldn't find it before I left the house because I was like, even out here where I have no cellular connectivity, I'm still being bombarded by cosmic
Right, of
radiation.
course.
And that's a whole other subject, but is it? Because there's this question of like, well, what is that? Again, what is the
Totally, man.
radiation? Like, are we? I know a lot of people who feel like they go sunbathing and they're getting codes from the sun, and I no longer rule that out
Man,
as a
and
possibility.
yeah, yeah. Dude, there's so much I want to riff on. I mean, all the way going back to randomness. Another person who thinks randomness is a fairy tale is Bernardo Kastrup, and it's for this, from what I understand, like it's the same reason you're talking about. Is it's yeah, when you're in this limited scope of human perception, any reasonably complex thing is going to appear random at first. But if you were able to zoom out, or you were able to grow your intellect large enough, what seems random would not be random. I mean, that's probably doing some level of violence to his rationale, but that's my basic understanding. And again, like you brought up Plato's cave, dude. It's one of my favorite things about that. I don't even know what to call it, because it's not just a myth. It's not just a story. It's like it's a sense making scaffolding that you can literally project over the top of everything that you were talking about, because it's not as simple, for example, as the shadows on the wall being a lie, right? Like, for to refresh everybody's memory, this is a story where the gist of it is you have these people living in a cave. They spend their whole lives facing a blank wall where there are shadows projected on the wall, and to them, that is their reality. The shadows get names. The drama of the shadows is like all they can talk about. And to a degree, you want to say that's a lie, right? But it's not that it's a lie, because it is projected from a source of truth, right? It's just that it's a very limited kind of truth. And when the prisoner is eventually freed, and he sees that what he was seeing was an object passing in front of a flame, that's a higher level of truth, right? But that's not the truth either. So then there's like it also maps onto Plato's divided line analogy, if you're familiar with that, where again it all goes back to what I was talking about before, that there is a highest facility of human consciousness, and that is reflected in when you gain in the story, when you gain actual recognition of the sun, to tie it back into your example of receiving things from the sun. And then when you look into what the sun represents to a Platonist, it just keeps fractaling out from there, because it's yeah, it's so much more than a story. It's like a sense making mechanism that's nestled in between other sense making mechanisms in a story form, that to me is immortal, and I don't see how you can ever get beyond it, because it's so well thought out. But also talking about this idea of being in this endless ocean of signals upon signals of different kinds, some that we're making, some that we recognize, some that we're probably passively receiving that are impacting us in ways that we don't understand. Like, obviously everyone knows they're being impacted by the rays of the sun because they can feel the radiation on their bodies. But who knows if the electromagnetic shit is interfering with us? Who knows if there's like a, astral thought field that's running through humanity, like a noosphere? Who knows if the planets have consciousness? Who knows if the sun has consciousness? So there's like all of these things that, yeah, they're exemplified in Plato's cave, but another great way that they're exemplified, which by someone we've brought up a couple of times in a glancing way now, Bob Wilson, Robert Anton Wilson, is that you can completely lose yourself in this hall of mirrors, this like epistemological sense making funhouse that we're all in. And you can project onto things, or maybe actually have experiences that some people would call projection or schizophrenic. And you just are never going to know for sure. And trying to figure out how to make sense of that kind of a worldview is something that I think that we're still not only like here's the fucked thing about the meaning crisis, and the whole I don't even think you can be wrapped in just the meaning crisis, because it goes beyond even meaning. Is it's not like the difficulty is in a static position. It's getting harder to make sense of things all the time. Because it's like, well, how do we make sense of the internet? Here's AI. How do we make sense of AI? Here's whatever the next thing is. And it just never stops. And it keeps getting more and more complex. And when you're faced with that kind of sense making problem, where it's continuously getting more complex, like you're trying to walk through this maze and they just keep making a harder, more difficult maze or escape room or something. I think what it honestly implies is that you sort of have to build a different relationship with reality. Like the idea that it can be solved is not really a good way to operate. And I think Robert Anton Wilson in many ways sort of realized that, and exemplified that in Cosmic Trigger, which was written in the 70s, by the way, which is incredible because he was already looking down the barrel of things that we're just beginning to grapple with in more advanced, nuanced ways, like things like extraterrestrial intelligences, and you know, could aliens or whatever they are be actually psychic in nature and not physical in nature, or spiritual in nature, or is there any difference? And it's just, man, we've hit this point in the conversation where I'm just like, I feel the funhouse effect, because it's just we've introduced so many things that are both scientifically measurable, yet also completely imply a new depth of mystery that you just never can begin to wrap your mind around.
And and ultimately, like, so I after I left SFI, I started work at this stealth pre-seed nonprofit AI startup, and I just quit that startup because I came on board thinking that one of the questions I was going to get to pursue in the line of work with them was about how wisdom keeps pace with power.
Mm.
I mean, that was very explicit in the marching orders for my initial bout of background research, so that they could demonstrate to funding agencies that they knew how to spend their money, not just on the, ensuring that their structures and processes were organizationally aligned with, legendary innovation, but also that they would innovate wisely. And then things got waylaid, as the urgency of, the looming specter of regulatory capture on open source AI by organizations like OpenAI, haha,
Right, yeah.
uh, they like getting people scared of leaving these tools in the hands of the people, in order that they can be concentrated in the hands of very few and, unfathomably wealthy institutions and the individuals in charge of them. All this Game of Thrones nonsense. uh I maintain, I am a devout advocate for open source, in spite of the fact that it it does mean that we need far better mechanisms for community oversight or surveillance, right?
Mm.
Neighborhood watch.
Mm.
A village raises a child. Maker labs. I saw this talk by the head of a maker lab when I was at Boom Festival in 2016, speaking on psychedelic futurism. And somebody asked this person, what do you do if someone expresses an interest in getting access to dangerous pathogens.
Yeah.
If someone looks like they're going to make a bomb or a
Yeah.
plague or whatever, do you just cut those people off? And they're like, no, because they're going to go somewhere else. That's like, extra exercising these people is how you end up with supervillains. The correct thing to do is to fold them in and to teach them how to handle these things wisely in order to do the research that they want to do, and to make sure that it's being done somewhere that other people can keep their eyes on it. And I feel the same way about AI. I feel that uh, we're at a point now where we've crossed over the threshold to, like, should we have assault rifles, to there are these things in the world,
Yeah.
and the solution is not necessarily that everyone is armed to the gills, but that everyone knows how to handle these tools safely. Everyone should learn fire. Everyone should learn language.
Yeah.
And this is just another one of these fundamental cultural technologies that sits on this stack that we take for granted. And we're asking ourselves the same question people were asking themselves about writing thousands of years ago now.
Right.
And yeah, we lose things in the process. Again, that's another fabulous piece of the conversation between Damian Walter and Ian McGilchrist about, what is lost in these information technology phase transitions. But uh but yeah, so I was working with this group, and I just left like a week ago to pursue funding and collaboration for two different projects, one of which is another podcast I want to start called Humans on the Loop, which is about wise innovation and holistic technology and how we maintain our agency, and we can keep our hands on the helm of this thing. And this other book that I want to write, my first book, How to Live in the Future, is in press now with Revelor,
Oh, cool.
Jeremy Johnson's publisher.
Nice.
And the second book that I want to write, I need to find somebody that can help me pitch this to publishers, is Jurassic Worlding, a paleontology of the present, which is about science fiction as self-fulfilling prophecy and
Hmm.
the erosion of the boundary between the virtual and the physical,
Yeah.
and using the
So,
novel and
y-
film Jurassic Park as a kind of lens through which to understand how
mm,
storytelling leads to discovery and innovation that makes storytelling that much closer to just the manifestation of imagination.
yeah, it's almost like
And
oracular in a way. Yeah.
yeah, so last summer when we were hanging out at the MAPS conference, and we
Yeah.
had this whole conversation about, we as we've had many, but that was the most recent conversation that we had about Hermes and Techne and all this stuff. And I really feel like my life is coming into focus now, where it's like, look, I don't need to be involved in pushing the river here. Like, these tools have so much momentum, so much attention and energy and financial support and human power behind them, because they are exerting a top down pressure on us behaviorally, because they lead to the influx of capital and opportunity and so on. Just it's an extension of this archontic city egregore thing that's going on. um, what we need desperately is, like Jeffrey West was saying, a twinned course, a parallel course of innovation that involves the reclamation of indigenous wisdom and other, ancient esoteric wisdom
Yeah.
about the safe handling of powerful technology.
Right.
And, so even like we give up thinking that we can understand everything, because it is the quest to understand and control everything that is
Yes.
generating all of this, this critical meta crisis nonsense. Uh, and it requires more and more and more computational resources, which, like you were saying, just snowballs everything in complexity and creates an even bigger metabolic footprint on the planet. And at some point, we just need to accept that even our godlike machines are going to bump up against something that is ineffable.
Yeah, or
And they're
maybe they'll summon it.
Yeah, so it's like Dan Simmons's Hyperion contest, where we make the machines, and then the machines make their own gods, and then and it just keeps going, and it's like, all right, well, so that's not
Yeah.
the. I mean, in some sense, like Bobby Azarian might argue that
Whoa.
that's the point, is that we are participating in this constant
Yeah.
unfolding of endogenous novelty production and the self-organization of new layers of meta individuality and cognition and consciousness. But there's no end to this game. It's going to go on forever, or at least it will go on until it undermines itself and collapses and then starts over and keeps trying to climb the hill again and again. And this is where Bobby and I kind of lock horns
Hmm.
about, like how much of this is given, how much of this is, like it's just because we can see a mountain doesn't mean there aren't chasms between us and and reaching that peak, and
Yeah.
we need to be careful about how we proceed. But yeah, it's just like, okay, like we get back to enjoying the journey, and the journey is in learning to deal with what is and accept that we cannot make fully informed decisions. We cannot run an economy on this fictitious idea of full cost accounting, because that would assume that we can assign a quantitative value to everything. And we don't even know what is,
Right. Yeah.
we don't even know what's there.
Yeah.
96% of this is dark. Right. So, how can we trade that on the stock market? And so, yeah, so again, like epistemic humility is the only reasonable place to start when it comes to asking what to do with AI. And furthermore, uh, another paper I think I brought up in my conversation with Danny Jones was this wonderfully titled preprint called Hallucination is Inevitable, about language models and how you can't get rid of these bizarre artifacts that that defy our attempts to use AI to just make it do what we want,
Yeah.
and how AI, in as it is currently instantiated, is closer to something like the dreaming mind. It's in a weird way like, the left brain built the right brain.
Hmm.
We in our attempts to know everything, what we did is we created this mechanical imagination
Hmm.
that is leading us deeper and deeper into the dark night of the ostensible rational enlightenment, and into an ever more intimate tangle with the unknown and the unknowable. And that's what Future Fossils is all about. And that's what Humans on the Loop, hopefully, should I find the people to, give me the living wage I need to make it happen. That's what that show will be all about, and figuring out how we can initiate people as wizards and witches of our new digital magic scape.
Yeah, man. There are three things I want to try to fold into this because I had three like micro epiphanies or things that I felt like I needed to bring up to you. So the idea of the ethics around AI, just a real quick plug because you might want to look into it. I've done a couple pods with this guy Timothy Owen Desmond, who actually got his PhD under Richard Tarnas, and he has a book called Singularity and Psyche. But his most recent thing that he has started doing is he's basically just writing papers regarding the idea of creating a new bill of rights that has to do with AI and sense making and adding some kind of like mytho poetic grounding to it, I guess, or at least some kind of ethics to it. I haven't read them, to be honest, but he brought it up last time we talked, so I wanted to bring that up. But two, um, I think when you get into this hall of mirrors, everything is so unknowable. I don't know like what's up and what's down. I think again, this points to the importance of learning to see archetypally, because when you can see archetypally, you see that you see this inevitability I'm talking about because it is part of the system, right? Like this revolutionary technological innovation that robs the old power and then eventually gets absorbed into the old power. Like this is mercurial, this is uranic and Promethean for the astrology and mythology nerds out there. Like that is one of the archetypal qualities, and it's not good or bad. It's disruptive. Like because even the myth of Prometheus itself, right? To put it in like an easy container to talk about it, you could look at it as Prometheus being either a hero or a villain. Like from the perspective of the established power, he was a villain, and the cost for what he did was being chained up for eternity and having his liver eaten over and over by an eagle, right? And from our perspective, it's like, well, thank God we have fire. But you could wrap any of these conversations or novel technologies or breakthroughs in that paradigm. And speaking of Richard Tarnas, he does such a good job in Passion of the Western Mind, going through the history of ideas and in some cases technology, and showing this cost. There's like always this breakthrough and then a cost, a breakthrough and then a cost. And in his what he explores, a lot of times it's a sense making cost, right? It's like one that he talks about all the time is like the Copernican revolution did a tremendous amount to tell us about the truth of the solar system. It also did a tremendous amount to spiritually and epistemologically decenter us, right? Because it literally moved us from the center to the outside of the solar system. And it degraded the spiritual understanding of us being the center of God's creation and all of these things. So it's always just there's constantly this interplay of these archetypal forces, and being able to zoom out and see a way in at least the overused cliche phrase of like history doesn't repeat but it rhymes. It's like that is somewhat comforting to me. It is somewhat comforting to be like, yeah, of course this is going to happen, because this is part of the grammar of reality. It happens over and over and over again. It's almost like just like the chorus in a song or the sad bridge part in the song, it's going to come back around again. And there is some comfort and I think epistemological grounding that comes from that.
It is a kind of a comforting thought to know it releases us from having to get there. Having to, and again, that's another kind of Jungian thing. This enantiodromia, that
Mm-hmm.
in the struggle to achieve some ideal, we end up producing its opposite.
Yes, dude.
And
Oh,
yeah,
it's so spooky. It's so spooky that you said that, because the third thing that I wanted to bring in there, um, that I sort of just got too far away from to want to bring up, is I was listening to a great episode of a great podcast that I bring up every fucking week at this point, called The Secret History of Western Esotericism. And if you haven't heard of it, it's done by a PhD classicist who also studied at that place in Amsterdam. That's like the only place to get a graduate degree in Hermetic Studies. So
I
he's
think the
like,
Weird Studies guys have spoken of this
possibly,
show
it's
a few
really,
times. Yeah,
really, really good. But Proclus is this later Platonist who we have a ton of writings from, because he is later, like I think around 400 AD, kind of considered one of the last great masters. But he has a massive uh, theology and metaphysics output. And one of the things like that, this is what triggered me wanting to bring this back, is that, and also this is what I originally brought it on, is you talking about this idea of almost by creating something, like creating a new technology, you're implying something else has to exist as a, almost in the same way like a shadow's your conscious mind implies an unconscious mind, and there being this kind of permeability between the two. Um, so Proclus's theology is like, and metaphysics is like hyper rational, and it's essentially like a Euclidean proof approach to understanding metaphysics. So he's using like mathematical principles basically in his emanationist, um, scaffolding of the cosmos, to a point where it is like this crazy complex logical ecosystem of archetypes and gods and forces. And yeah, it's insane, man. Like, I've only just started to look into this, but it's basically what you were talking about exactly, that in logically, if you just sat down for years and logically walked your way through this like schizophrenic, uh sort of Euclidean proof that he created, it's pretty nuts. It's pretty nuts. So that the people have been thinking this way for a long time, and some people have done the work, and he's one of those people who have done the work.
Because why not? I want to throw another log on this bonfire
Yeah, let's
and give
do
a
it.
shout out to fellow New Mexican Brett Anderson, whose YouTube series Intimations of a New Worldview I just binge watched. He's got like 25 hours of this lecture that he put together while an evolutionary psychology student of Jeffrey Miller at UNM, and before he rage quit academia. And I'm still like looking forward to getting in touch with him and hearing the whole story on that. He kind of alludes to some of it in this talk about how he feels that the academic world has become polluted by political psychopathology, but which frankly completely mirrors my own experience of it, although I need not go into detail. But Brett ties complex systems theory together with Jung and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and asks this question about how are we to regain some kind of sense, a metaphysics of the cosmos, and what is the will to power that Nietzsche suggested that is, uh, you know, there for us to use as an affordance to regain place for ourselves in a cosmic order after we have killed God, after we have disabused ourselves of Christian cosmology that everyone took for granted for so many hundreds of years. And his synthesis of all of this stuff is that the hero's journey, and this whole series is right up your alley, and I highly
Oh,
recommend it to
what's
you
his name again?
specifically. Brett Anderson,
Sounds familiar.
Sen, Intimations of a New Worldview on YouTube. He hasn't put out a thing in a while, but it's a spree of videos that he put out last year. He is now a public school teacher. I think he found a happier place for himself, but he gives this synthesis where he says that the hero journey meta myth
Hmm.
is actually a story about accepting the radical enlargement of the scope of one's responsibility to that which is greater than yourself,
Hmm.
uh, and that the return, the boon bringing final phase, or in what the 10th Oxfording picture of Zen, where the awakened practitioner comes back down into the marketplace, brings the cattle
Yeah.
to market, that this is the this is the where the truth of what is, is uh, finally encoded in a behavioral injunction, where the true meets the good.
Mm,
And that really what we're talking about here is accepting the pain of the crisis of self-transformation. And again, like the Promethean, being lashed to the
yeah.
the boulder, or Sisyphus, etc. Um, that this is all something that we should accept with joy, because it is necessary in order to break us open into the into alignment with this process of self transcending
Yeah.
transformation. And that a lot of this is based on, he goes into delicious amount of detail about self-organized criticality, which is another idea that comes out of complex systems thinking, and about how always pushing yourself, always being at the edge of your capacity
Hmm.
is necessary, because you have to cross through the dark night of the soul. You have to go through the
Right.
phase transition. You have to leave one peak on the fitness landscape, cross a trough,
Yep.
or transform the landscape in some way to create a bridge, which a lot of the Andreas Wagner, evolutionary biologist, talks a lot about intelligent evolutionary behavior in bacterial populations, where they do seem to be able to create reservoirs of latent novelty that allow them to execute what seem like anticipatory mutations
Oh, wow.
in response to environmental toxins and other things. So like there are these ways that the latent possible expression of genotype and phenotype in living systems gives us like tools at hand. And it's messy to carry all of that stuff around. Anyway, so yeah, so Anderson's got a lot to say about stepping out the door of one's comfort
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
onto the path, and what it means, in like in my case, to be like, okay, you hear the call of your daimon.
Yes. Yes.
you know
Yes.
you hear you hear this. You understand that it may be terrifying to quit your job when you've got kids to feed in order to pursue something that matters immensely to the unfolding of our healthy society and biosphere and technosphere and so on. But like, stop acting as though the right thing to do is to kill yourself clinging to security.
Yes.
And all of us face this again and again and
Yes.
again.
Yes, brother. Yeah. Individuation is not a comfortable thing. Breaking out of the egg, going through any successive growing pain, threshold, whatever, it's never easy. And yet, I too like that this is the thing that I'm captured by too, man. Like that on a micro level, there's got to be something going on. Like and Jung would use the language of nature often. He would say that evolution or that individuation is fulfilling what nature wants, quote unquote, like what psyche is trying to do. Like you and this is also like I haven't read enough of Aristotle's actual work to know if this is what he was suggesting, but I'm sure you're aware how there's this sort of like divide, like popularly Aristotle is interested in the organism, the particular, the empirical, whereas Plato was kind of like the rational, the universal, the transcendent, right? But one of the things that ends up happening with Aristotle's thought is his teleology is like this teleology of becoming. Like and this folds back in with Hillman and Jung too, in that the acorn is designed to become the oak tree. Like it has a teleological journey that it goes on, but there's no guarantee that that journey ever fulfills itself, but it's there, right? Like the potential is there. And it's the same with each person. And then if you really want to fuck your mind, read a book like Passion of the Western Mind and tell me when you're done with that it doesn't feel like we're collectively going through something like that. Like where there is this whatever dimensional psychophysical spiritual oak tree that humanity is slowly becoming, and to the extent to which you either fulfill your little part of it, you either contribute to it or you don't. And that kind of a process theology sort of scenario is is the thing that gets me going. And if that sounds like too much for people, go the Eastern route. Just listen to some Alan Watts. You're already perfect. Don't worry about it. Just be, I guess. But I like that shit too. Don't get me wrong. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. But also, I feel called to like tend to the fire and tend to the growth in some small way. Whether that's all just in my head or something I'm biased toward, I don't know. But I'm with you, man.
Well, you just spoke directly to the argument I keep having with Bobby Azarian, not to drag him through the bramble on all of this, but I mean, the emergentism that people like Bobby and Brendan Graham Dempsey are advocating for, again, I don't think gives sufficient attention to this issue of the epistemic nature of randomness and the fact that we are kind of high on our own fumes if we want to claim, as so many people like Ken Wilber and Andrew Cohen and countless others have claimed, that we are Kurzweil, that we are the growing tip of the evolutionary process. Like, we genuinely do not know,
right?
And furthermore, we are not guaranteed success. And just be like, for instance, there's information theoretical research, there's stuff on black holes where it's like, well, technically you can't, in practical terms, you cannot extract information from the event horizon when something has entered a black hole, but theoretically you can. It would just require a computer larger than the universe in order to do it. And so we're back to this thing about like, okay, well, whoops, we lost a wedding ring down the toilet. Now we need to build a computer larger than the universe to go fish it out. And that's ridiculous. And, so you get into this Taoist thing.
But what if it's a quantum computer, though?
Yes, but, you get this, the Lao Tzu, talks about how, a healthy village can hear the roosters crowing from the next village and not feel like not feel FOMO, not feel like they're missing out on something if they don't go and investigate this thing. And I am not speaking as an enemy of discovery, because obviously, like, curiosity, as I feel like is, one of my great refrains, is that, curiosity is the antidote to fear, and that we live in a very anxious time. And I want to help people be more curious and more playful about what it is that we're living through. But also, there's a difference between curiosity and a kind of Faustian obsession or urge to, to enact the manifest destiny of something. Just because the horizon is there does not mean that you must go, unless it does, right? Unless Rilke says, you must change your life. Nor does it mean you will get there, because as soon as you do, the horizon is somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah. And then in the process, like, maybe, answering the call is about discovering yourself along the path. And at this point, we've sort of just decayed. We're degenerate into decay, into cliche. But you know,
Cliche for a reason.
but you know, I do feel that it's a far more rewarding and humorous exercise that one can engage in with far greater levity to participate in this evolutionary unfolding, this erotic unfolding.
Yeah. And to
If
a degree, sorry,
Yeah,
no,
if you're not trying
continue.
to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. And to a degree too, right? Like we're left with not necessarily like a Pascal's wager, but like a I mean, there's a couple different ways to look at it because you could look at it like in a sort of like Kierkegaardian way about like leap taking, right? Like you don't fucking know, so why not just would you? This is a way oversimplification, but you don't know. You're going to be anxious about it, but it's better to take the leap than not to take the leap. And you could also make this more meta and more mercurial and psychedelic by approaching it again like the Robert Anton Wilsonian way. It's like pick your fighter, right? Like choose your operating system, like choose your reality tunnel. You don't know, so don't delude yourself. Like choose a few reality tunnels or ways of thinking or operating systems that are attractive to you and also seem to reasonably well represent reality, and then dive into it like without question. I talked about this a little bit too with Josh Ray from the Emerald. Like at a certain point, you need to like quiet your critical mind and your frontal lobe and just settle into a practice and settle into something. And this could be you could take this spiritually, professionally, artistically, philosophically. It's just true. Like you're not gonna necessarily like even if you're individuating, right? Yes, you've got to do your own thing. You've got to walk your own path, but you're going to also be walking on roads that other people have laid the foundation of to some degree, even if you're on your own path, right? So you can have fun with it. Like pick your reality tunnel and just play.
Josh is a fine human being. He's actually teaching a course I'm co-facilitating right
Oh,
now
cool.
on embodied ethics in the age of AI. And Andrew Dunn, formerly of the Center of Humane Technology and Turquoise Sound, and uh, several others that are involved in this course. We're all convening this coming weekend in Northern California to discuss the formation of a new organization devoted to the stuff that I was talking about earlier about this, wise innovation and holistic technology. We don't know what shape it's going to precisely take, but yeah, I just had Josh on Future Fossils also, and
Oh, nice.
talking about precisely this thing about his fantastic episode on AI and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and what does it mean to initiate ourselves, and to learn to negotiate the power of the genius. uh what does it mean if, like, I love shows like The Tick for this
Oh yeah,
reason.
yeah.
Like there's
I
this
thought
this
about
has
that a
become
lot
kind
too.
of a standard trope in postmodern superhero fictions, where it's like where everybody's a superhero and now what, or like in The Incredibles, when, what is it, the Brainiac or whatever, the villain, I forget his name. Yeah, I'm not a, sorry guys, but
You only
he's
know
a
obscure scientists and extremely exact statistics and weird shit, not Incredibles characters. I can
well,
cut you a break for that.
I am constantly on the threshold of criticality, is actually what it is with memory. uh but yeah, he's, let's see,
I think
syndrome,
Syndrome,
buddy,
okay.
yeah, Buddy Pine syndrome. But yeah, when he says, and if everyone's a superhero, then no one is. If everyone's super, then no one is. And it's like, yeah, it's like, okay, the arms race moves on, like you were saying earlier about, like, once we've solved one thing, like the mysteries retreated over to the next tree laughing at you from over there. And so yeah, like, I really, really I have great distaste for really both extremes of the argument around AI, where people are either saying evolve or die. Like, I have
Mm-hmm.
no sympathy for you if you can't keep up with this. So you might as well just get with the
Yeah, yeah.
program and
Luddite.
accept Yeah, Luddite. Cory Doctorow has written so much good stuff about how the Luddites were not anti-technology; they were anti-corporate enclosure.
Mm.
They were. It was not about the fact that mechanical looms exist. It was the fact that this was a way of screwing over people in a labor
Yeah.
negotiation and generating uh, products of deteriorating quality in the process. But
So exactly like what's going on with AI and creatives and the writers. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. O has made the point that it's like, yeah, it's a long way from AI actually being able to do your job, but AI is definitely already at the point where it can convince HR that they can let go of
Right.
you
Right. Right.
and have a machine do it worse. And that has this is going on everywhere we look right now. But then on the other side of the argument, you have people that are just genuinely opposed to it and clinging to. One of my big things, I talked about this in response to a piece that Are You Serious, aka Ken
Oh
Goffman,
yeah.
former editor of Mondo 2000 and H Plus magazine, wrote for. He has a blog at Mindplex now, and he wrote this piece on the history of analog and digital sampling and how the argument around sampling pertains to the argument around mass data collection for the training of language models,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and how this idea that people want to create an ever more penetrating and omnipresent panopticon of royalty disbursement and rights tracking in order to solve the problem of whose data is being scraped non-consensually to train models is just so backwards. Because, and I can link you to the thread. I've got a huge list of stuff we're going to drop in the show notes for you folks later.
Yeah.
I've been
Please.
annotating as we go. The response that I gave to RU's article is just that, yeah, like what people are really fighting over are the scraps of the Creative Commons that has been eviscerated by successive waves of enclosure and redefinition by intellectual property law. And so people are they're fighting for the right to fight over this like dwindling island of opportunity, when in fact we could just flip this entirely so that the definition of the value of the product of one's creative labors is recognized as this much larger process of horizontal information exchange and
Mm-hmm.
lineal information exchange, something more like the exchange of biological information through the horizontal gene transfer, like bacterial plasmids, as well as through cellular mitosis. And that when we think of ourselves as networked and permeable and nested in larger networks and made of junior networks, that it becomes laughable to consider that we would ever be able to claim that some idea started with us and that we deserve credit for it without making the same claim backcast to everyone whose ideas we have inherited. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, it's unreasonable to ask that we burrow ourselves even deeper into the matrix as a way of serving the digital precariat,
Yeah.
the ever more endangered creative class, uh, when that would require that we somehow we owe unfathomable back taxes
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to the dead. Forget it. And of course everything that we're building is is, as William Irwin Thompson talks about in his book, The American Replacement of Nature. The entire economy based on usury and value creation through the production of debt and the the supposed creation of value by cooking the books and leaving the actual costs of the production of goods and services on the sort of black end of the ledger, where we don't have, or the dark end of the ledger, where we don't have any way of accurately
Mhm.
tracking what we're actually spilling into the water table, etc. Um, that's all also borrowing, as Roman Kritsnarik has talked about, and being his work on being good ancestors. That's borrowing from the unborn.
Yeah.
So there's really no way to say, like, I am entitled to this. But that applies not just to the individual creators that are getting screwed over by OpenAI and the Lion 5B training data set and stability and all these other groups. It applies to them even more than it applies to us, in the same way that it's ridiculous that BP and Exxon would try to gaslight us into saying that we could be driving less, that we could be doing less to reduce individual carbon emissions, when in fact they are, by
Right, right, right,
orders
right.
of magnitude, the far greater culprits in the situation. So yeah, it's like, no, yeah, like, if, like, yes, we absolutely need a better system for helping people subside on the boons of the surplus created by aggregate novelty production than we have. But that doesn't look like just allowing ourselves to be exploited by these predatory institutions, nor does it look like securing us as the serfs in this digital feudalist structure the right to play by the rules of the lords. It's all ridiculous.
Yeah,
We need to be on to a completely different way of thinking about all of this stuff.
man. This is a whole new conversational hero's journey. I feel like you've just introduced, but well, we're gonna have to run it back. Maybe that will be a good place to start for the next one, because I definitely have thoughts in this conversation about AI, creativity, what it means to be a creative. Also just trying to thrust standards, the standards of that eroding island that you were talking about, onto a completely emergent new thing. I mean, it's like there's so much, man. There's so much in my own personal life too that has happened to me. Man, I will say this one thing. I was on a panel like maybe a year and a half ago now with a bunch of artists and Blue Tech, who obviously has really embraced AI. And I was the most outsider on all these artists, and we are talking about AI. And I was the most sort of like mercurial outsider, multidisciplinary creative. And I was just like watching this warfare occur in the conversation. It was very interesting in an almost like anthropological kind of way, where you're just kind of like, wow, I'm kind of like watching a moment in history where humans grapple with what something is and what it means, and they have not made sense of it yet. And I mean, I feel like we get one of those every 6 months in this timeline, but still, it's crazy just to be alive during these times and thinking about this shit and surfing on this shit, as you are well aware.
Yeah. Stay limble. Oh, stay limble. Stay
Dude,
limber.
that's
Stay
the
nimble.
perfect
Stay liminal.
words to fuck up. Stay liberal.
Blah. Not liberal. That's not what I. Yeah.
But
No.
not
Yeah.
liberal. I'm not saying don't be liberal.
Yeah. Yeah. Just stay loose, but not too loose. Right.
Hmm.